midnight on the 27th of April 1938, in a town hall in central Massachusetts, an orchestra stopped playing. The town clock struck 12, and 4 towns, by an act of the Massachusetts state legislature, ceased to exist. And their names were Donna, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. Together they had about 500 residents. Greenwich was the oldest, incorporated in 1754. It had been a working mill town for the better part of 2 centuries. Donna was incorporated in 1801, Enfield in 1816, Prescott in 1822. Between them, they had 7 schools, 4 post offices, the Swift River Hotel, the Quabbin Club, stretches of the Athol Branch Railway running through them, and the Boston Water Department watered the valley they sat in. Boston was running out of drinking water. The state agreed. The Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission began surveying the Swift River Valley in 1926. 12 years later, on the 27th of April 1938, every resident of those 4 towns was invited to one last gathering. They called it a farewell ball. They danced in the Enfield Town Hall until midnight. When the clock struck 12, the orchestra stopped, the lights went out, and a witness was quoted in the next morning's newspaper as saying, "The 4 towns died." Before was about the villages that left a tower above the surface. This episode is about the ones that didn't. 3,000 kilometers east of Massachusetts on the upper Volga River, the same thing happened 20 years earlier, to a scale 50 times larger. It is called the Rybinsk reservoir. When it was filled in 1941, it was the largest artificial body of water in the world. It covers 4,580 square kilometers. When the gates closed, 700 villages went. Underneath, the largest of them was a town called Mologa. Mologa had stood at the confluence of the Mologa and Volga rivers since at least the 12th century. From the late 14th to the early 16th century, it hosted one of the biggest medieval fairs in Russia. Merchants came from Novgorod, from Persia, from the Hanseatic ports of the Baltic. It had a cathedral, it had a convent, it had 6 monasteries within the broader district. And it had about 7,000 residents. In 1935, construction began on the dam at Dryweryn. The work was done by Volgolag prisoners. Volgolag was a Gulag camp system. Roughly 880,000 people passed through its barracks between 1935 and 1953. Tens of thousands of them died in the work. The resettlement of the people who would lose their homes began in 1936. About 150,000 people were moved. Most of them were taken to nearby Rybinsk or Yaroslavl, or settled in surrounding rural districts. The last residents of Mologa were removed in 1940. On April 14th of 1941, the gates closed and the water began to rise. 8 days later, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Nothing continued through the war. It was finished in 1947. By then, Mologa was 30 feet under. There is a legend That's the case for 70 years. And it says that 294 residents of Mologa refused to leave, that they chained themselves to their homes or refused to walk out, and that they drowned where they had lived when the gates closed and the water rose. A figure of 294 traces, a single NKVD report cited by a Russian historian named Yuri Nesterov's. Mainstream Russian historians, including the curators of the Mologa Land Museum in Rybinsk, dispute the story. Mologa was not submerged in one event. The water rose slowly across 6 years. For 294 people to have drowned, they would have had to walk back into water that had been rising for years. The original document supporting the figure has never been found in the archives. But the story persists. The story persists because it carries something the documented record does not. It carries refusal. 3/4 of a century later, the descendants of the people who actually were moved still gather once a year in August on the eastern shoreline of the reservoir. They take small boats out to the spots above where the streets of Mologa used to be. Some of them lower flowers into the water. Some of them read the names of the relatives who were born there. And in very dry years, the water drops far enough that the foundations come back. In 1992 and again in 2014, the eastern shore of the Rybinsk Reservoir gave back the streets of the old town. These descendants walked across the silt where their grandparents had once walked across cobblestones. They picked up shards of glass, pieces of brick, a single key. Some of those objects are now in the Mologa Land Museum. The museum was founded in 1995 by the children and grandchildren of the displaced. They call themselves Mologans. They are the only formally organized community of internally displaced reservoir residents in the world. Massachusetts, 20 years, were Mologa. In 1926, the Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission of Massachusetts began drawing the boundaries of where would serve metropolitan Boston for the next century. It would be called the Quabbin Reservoir. 3 branches of the Swift River would be dammed at a town called Belchertown. The valley above the dam was 3 rivers wide inside it, 4 incorporated towns, parts of 7 others, 2,500 residents, 34 cemeteries. The state had the legal authority to take the land. It had used the same authority 20 years earlier to build the Wachusett Reservoir, drowning the town of Boylston for the same reason. Boylston had been smaller, 1 town. The Swift River Valley would be 4. The first announcement came in 1926. The actual disincorporation came 12 years later. In between, families that were already condemned. Some left immediately. Some stayed until the surveyors came up the road. Some refused to leave at all and had to be served notice by a county sheriff. The families that left were not relocated together. Belchertown took some, Hardwick took some, New Salem took some, Ware took most of them, because Ware was where the state had built the new cemetery. The new cemetery had a name. It was called Quabbin Park Cemetery. It was built between 1931 and 1932, specifically to receive the bodies that the Swift River Valley would no longer be able to keep. 613 graves were exhumed from 34 cemeteries across the 4 towns and the partial neighbors. Every gravestone was photographed before it was moved. Every original lot was mapped so that when the bodies were relaid in the new cemetery, it could be oriented the same way they had been buried originally. Some families chose other cemeteries. The state paid for the relocation either way. Most chose Quabbin Park. Most went to Quabbin Park because the people they were burying alongside had also lived in the Swift River Valley. The town that disappeared most completely was Enfield. Enfield was the largest of the four, about 500 residents. The town hall, the train station, the Swift River Hotel. The town hall was a 2-story wooden building on the main road. It hosted Enfield's town meetings, its court sessions, its school graduations, and on Saturday nights, its dances. It hosted the farewell ball on the 27th of April, 1938. More than 1,000 people attended. Many of them had driven in from towns where they had been relocated months or years earlier. Some had not been back since their families had left it. They danced until midnight. When the orchestra stopped, the chairman of the Enfield Board of Selectmen stood up and read the legislative order disincorporating the town. He read it word for word. Then the clock struck 12, and Enfield was no longer Enfield. Dana was no longer Dana. Greenwich was no longer Greenwich. Prescott was no longer Prescott. The filling of the reservoir began the following August. It took 7 years. By the summer of 1946, Quabbin was full. 2,500 people had been moved, 7,613 bodies had been exhumed, 34 cemeteries had been emptied, 4 towns had been erased from the state map. There was no bell tower above the water. The Boston Water Department had not wanted to leave anything visible that could later be claimed as a historical site by descendants. Every building above what would become the water line had been demolished. Every road that descended into the valley had been bulldozed at the new shoreline. What remained were the names. Dana Common is still accessible. There's a 3-mile foot road that descends through the woods on the peninsula above the water line. At the end of it, the original town common of Dana is still discernible. The rough outline of the green, the foundations of the town hall, the post office, a few houses. The National Park Service maintains a single bronze plaque listing the town offices of Dana as of 1938. There is no equivalent for the other 3 towns. Their commons are under the water. In dry years, parts of them come back. The drought of 1965 was the first time the reservoir level dropped enough to expose what was below: stone walls along old farm boundaries, mill foundations, a small culvert that had carried the Atholl Branch Railway. The Enfield Railway Depot Foundation reappeared along the eastern shoreline. A few descendants drove in to see it. The drought of 2016 exposed more. Old Route 21, the road that used to descend from the surrounding hills into the town of Dana, still descends into the water. It is paved in low water. The descent is walkable for 200 yards before it disappears under the surface. Descendants drive out from the surrounding towns when the level drops enough. Some of them are old enough to have been children in Enfield and Dana and Greenwich. In Prescott, they're in their 90s now. They walk down the road as far as they can. Some take photographs, some sit on a stone wall and do not say anything. The Swift River Valley Historical Society, New Celyn, keeps photographs, artifacts, and oral histories. It was founded in 1936, 2 years before the disincorporation, by the people who knew the towns were already being measured for their replacement. I started collecting before the towns were gone. Jane Yolen, who would later write a children's book about the flooding called Letting Swift River Go, was the daughter of a woman who had grown up in Prescott. The book is short. It is dedicated to the children of the 4 towns. It ends with a sentence about the bells of the 4 towns ringing one last time on the night of the farewell ball, and then going under the water. Boston drinks the water. It is exceptionally clean. The reservoir is closed to recreational use. There are no marinas, no resorts, no swimming beaches on Quabbin, only the protected wooded shoreline and the dam at the south end. The water is clean because the towns are no longer above it. Mologa had a museum because the displaced organized to build one. Ballerino da Furna had a Furna. Because the displaced organized to build one, Curon has Heimat Fligiverband Südtirol. Because the displaced organized to build one, Quabbin has Quabbin Park Cemetery, the Swift River Valley Historical Society, the bronze plaque at Dana Common, and a children's book. What it does not have is a tower. What it has is the names of the people who used to live there, carved on grey stones in a cemetery built specifically to hold them in a town the 4 towns never knew. The dead were given a place, the towns were not. And the people who walked down to the old Route 21 in 1965 and again in 2016, in the dry years when the road came back, are running out of time. Across the Atlantic, in a small valley in the north of Wales, the same kind of paperwork was being drawn up on. It was 1956. The valley was called CWM Tryweryn. At the bottom of it, along the A1 Dryweryn, stood a village called Capel, Celyn. It had 12 houses and farms, a chapel, a graveyard, a school, a post office, a small railway halt on the Bala to Festiniog line. It had about 67 residents, where all of them spoke Welsh, and Capel Celyn was one of the last entirely Welsh monoglot communities in Wales. 300 miles to the north in Liverpool, the city council was drawing up a plan for a new reservoir. Liverpool needed water. The Dryweryn Valley would supply it. The Dryweryn Bill was introduced in the United Kingdom Parliament in 1956. It allowed Liverpool City Council to compulsorily purchase the entire valley. No consent was required from any Welsh local authority. There was no Welsh office yet to ask. 125 Welsh local authorities opposed the bill. Of the 36 Welsh members of Parliament, 27 voted against it. None voted for it. The bill passed because the English members carried it. The residents of Capel Celyn organized a defense committee in 1956, and again in 1957 they marched through the streets of Liverpool, carrying signs in Welsh and in English. The marches were peaceful. They were photographed, they were ignored. Construction on the dam began in 1960. In February of 1963, a transformer on the construction site was blown apart. 3 young Welshmen, Owain Williams, Emir Llewellyn Jones, and John Albert Jones, had placed explosives there in the night. Emir Llewellyn Jones was arrested and imprisoned for 12 months. Construction continued. The valley was emptied in the spring of 1965. The graves in the chapel graveyard were exhumed. Some were reinterred in a small new memorial chapel built on higher ground above the waterline. The chapel itself was demolished. The school was demolished. The houses were demolished. The post office was demolished. The valves of the new dam were closed in October of 1965. The reservoir was named Celyn, and there's no farewell ball. The Dryweryn flooding was not the first time it had happened in Wales. 77 years earlier, in 1888. The city of Liverpool had done the same thing in a different Welsh valley. The village was called Llangollen. It had 37 houses, 10 farmhouses, 3 inns, 2 chapels, a school, a mill, a post office, and a 16th century parish church. It had about 400 residents. The Vyrnwy Dam was the first large stone-built dam in the United Kingdoms. The valves were closed on the 28th of November, 1888. 400 graves were exhumed and reinterred in a new churchyard downstream. A new Llangollen was built downstream, new stone houses, a new church, a new graveyard. The pattern was being written down. There were petitions, there were protest articles in the Welsh language newspapers. There was no organized national resistance because the political infrastructure for it did not yet exist. By the time the Tryweryn Bill was introduced in 1956, that infrastructure had been built, but it was not yet powerful enough to stop the bill. What it did do was carry the memory. In 1965, the year the valves closed at Celyn, a young Welsh poet named Mike Stevens drove out to a ruined cottage wall beside the F487 road near the village of Llanrhystr in Ceredigion. He had a tin of white paint and a brush. He painted 2 words on the wall. Cofiwch, it means remember Tryweryn. The wall has been painted over by vandals dozens of times in the years since. Every time someone has come back with a tin of white paint and repainted the 2 words. It is now a quasi-official national monument. Copies of it appear on stone walls and gable ends across Wales. In 25, on the 40th anniversary, the city of Liverpool formally apologized for the flooding of Capel Celyn. The apology was carried in every Welsh language newspaper. Many of the original residents had died by then. Celyn drops during dry summers. In 1976, the worst heat wave drought in modern British history, the base of the old chapel walls came back above the water. So did the old road bridge over the Tryweryn, so did the foundations of the farms. And it happened again in 1989, again in 2018, again in the autumn of 2022, and each time descendants drove up to the eastern shoreline and walked down to the foundations. Some of them had been children in Capel Celyn before the valves closed. They are in their 70s and 80s now. The annual memorial service is still held at the small chapel above the waterline. It is conducted in Welsh. The chapel itself was built as part of the compromise after the public outcry. The dam went through, the chapel was the bone the city threw back. It enough to hold the service, and it is not enough to bring the village back. The Cofiwch Dryweryn wall is now painted periodically by people who were not born when the valves closed. They learned the 2 words from their grandparents. And the wall keeps holding. 7 years after the valves closed at Celyn, a different valley on the other side of the world was being measured for the same kind of paperwork. The valley was in the southwest wilderness of Tasmania. At the bottom of it was a small glacial lake, about 1 million years ago. It was called Lake Pedder. Its defining feature was a beach of crushed pink quartzite, 3 kilometers long and almost 1 kilometer wide. In the afternoon sun, the beach shimmered pink. The beach, that small aircraft would land on it. Through the 1950s and 60s, Bush pilots flew tourists in to walk it. Lake Pedder was declared a national park in 1955. In 1967, the Tasmanian government revoked its national park status to enable damming. The Hydroelectric Commission of Tasmania planned 3 connected dams on the Gordon, the Serpentine, and the Edgar Rivers. A new reservoir would be 24,000 hectares. It would drown the original Lake Pedder under 15 meters of new water. Resistance organized quickly. In March of 1972, a group of Tasmanian conservationists founded a small political party to contest the state election on a single issue. We called it the United Tasmania Group. It is now widely recognized as the first organized green political party in the world. One of its founding members was a 54-year-old former school teacher named Brenda Hean. Hean had been a senior figure in the Lake Pedder Action Committee since its founding in 1967. She had walked the pink beach, she had photographed it, she had spent 5 years writing letters and giving speeches and lobbying politicians to stop the flooding. By September of 1972, the dams were closing in. Hean decided to make one last public gesture. She would fly from Hobart to Canberra in a small biplane and skywrite the words, "Save Lake Pedder," above the Federal Parliament building. The biplane was said to have a Land Tiger Moth, 2-seat, open cockpit, fabric and wood, built in the 1930s as a training aircraft, the kind of plane that demanded its pilot be visible. Her pilot was a 36-year-old Hobart aviator named Max Price. On the night of the 7th of September 1972, the Tiger Moth was in its hangar at Cambridge Aerodrome east of Hobart. Sometime during that night, the hangar was broken in 2. The break-in was reported the next morning. Nothing visible had been taken. Investigators would later allege that someone had tampered with the aircraft's fuel system. Specific reports cited the fuel cap and possibly sugar introduced into the fuel tank. No suspect was ever charged. On the morning of the 8th of September, 1972, Brenda Hean and Max Price took off from Cambridge Aerodrome. The flight plan filed was Hobart to Canberra with a refueling stop on the eastern Tasmanian coast. They were last seen by witnesses on the ground at about 10 in the morning, flying north over the east coast of Tasmania. The Tiger Moth never reached a refueling stop. A massive air-sea search was launched along the east coast and across Bay Strait. It ran for 10 days. No wreckage was found, no fuel slick, no bodies, no personal effects. Nothing. The coroner's inquest opened in 1973. Witnesses described the hangar break-in, the reported tampering with the fuel system, the political profile of the passenger. The coroner returned an open verdict, open meaning. The cause of death could not be determined, and the possibility of foul play could not be excluded. No further inquiry was opened. The dams closed the following year. The original Lake Pedder and Pink Quartzite Beach went under 15 meters of new water. In 2008, an Australian filmmaker named Scott Millwood released a documentary on the case. It was called Whatever Happened to Brenda Hean. Millwood spent 6 years interviewing the surviving members of the Lake Pedder Action Committee, ground witnesses, and former Hydroelectric Commission staff. He concluded that the evidence consistent with sabotage was strong enough to warrant a reopening of the inquiry. The inquiry was not reopened. No one was ever charged in connection with the disappearance. No wreckage of the tiger moth has ever been recovered. The aircraft, the pilot, and the passenger are still listed by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau as missing. Brenda Hean was 55 years old. Max Price was 36. The Restore Pedder campaign, the descendant organization of the Lake Pedder Action Committee, has continued to advocate for the draining of the reservoir, and engineering studies have suggested that the Pink Quartzite Beach is still down there, buried under sediment, largely intact. If the dam were ever decommissioned, the beach would, in time, come back. Biplane would not. Of all the cases in this episode, hers is the only one where we do not know what happened. We know how the others ended. We know where the bodies were moved. We know which graves were exhumed, which towers were left, and which were demolished, and why. We do not know what happened to Brenda Hean, and somewhere along the east coast of Tasmania, or out over Bay Strait on the morning of the 8th of September 1972, a small fabric and wood biplane went down. And the woman in the back seat did not get to skywrite the 2 words she had come there to write. And the reservoir she had come to stop is still there. Some erasures happen, and at a scale where individual stories cannot be told. In the south of China, along the middle stretch of the Yangtze River, the world's largest hydroelectric station was approved by the National People's Congress in 1992. It was called the Three Gorges Dam. The vote was 1767 in favor, 177 against, 644 abstaining. It was the largest dissent vote in the history of the National People's Congress. The reservoir began filling on the 1st of June 23. It reached its full design level of 175 meters in October of 2010. The reservoir is 600 kilometers long. Under it, 13 cities, 140 towns, 1,352 villages, 30,000 hectares of farmland, plus 1,283 archaeological sites, and 1,300,000 people. They were moved between 1993 and 2012. Some were resettled in rural districts above the new waterline. Some were moved to coastal cities 1,000 kilometers east. Some never received the compensation they were promised. The journalist who had compiled the dissenting scientific voices into a single book in 1989 was named Dai Ching. Her book was called Yangtze, Yangtze. It was banned in China. She was after Tiananmen for related activism. The Three Gorges Reservoir does not drop low enough during drought to expose anything. The water level is actively managed between 145 meters in summer, 175 meters in winter. The cities and the towns and the villages are sitting under 50 to 100 meters of permanent water. There will be no dry years. There will be no children who come back to walk the cobblestones. Across the Himalayas in northern India, the same kind of paperwork was being drawn up at the same time. The river was the Bhagirathi. It is one of the two headwater streams of the Ganges. The town at the confluence of the Bhagirathi and the Belanya was called Teri. It had been the capital of the princely state of Teri Garhal. It had a royal palace, it had a college, it had a clock tower. It had about 100,000 residents. Construction on the dam began in 1978. The dam was finished 28 years later in 26 at 260 meters high. It is one of the tallest dams in the world. 39 villages were submerged, along with the old town of Teri. About 100,000 people were moved. Most of them went to a new planned city built on a high ridge above the reservoir, 1,500 meters up. Residents would describe it in interviews as cold, windswept, without the fertility of the river valley they had come from. The clock tower stood above the rising water for years. Photographs of it, half submerged, are the visual icon of Old Teri. By 2006, clock tower was gone. A Gandhian environmentalist named Sunderlal Bahuguna had spent decades opposing the dam. In 1995, he undertook a 74-day hunger strike beside the construction site. He cited seismic risk, he cited downstream sacred geography, he cited the displacement. The strike ended after the Prime Minister agreed to a review committee, and the review changed nothing. Bahuguna died of COVID-19. In 2021, she was 94. Like the Three Gorges, the Teri Reservoir does not drop low enough during drought to expose Old Teri. The clock tower is gone. Its photograph is what remains in the Sertão of northeast Brazil along the San Francisco River. The same paperwork had been drawn up a decade earlier. The dam was called the Luiz Gonzaga, named after the Foro musician from the region. It was finished in 1988. Under it, the original town of Petrolandia, population at the time of flooding, about 10,000 and then brought it to Parika Reservoir Project, about 40,000 people across 7 municipalities of Pernambuco and Bahia. The new Petrolandia was built on higher ground, about 10 kilometers away. Residents would describe it in interviews as sterile, badly planned, without the curve of the river to organize the streets around. The old parish church, the Igreja do Sagrado Coração de Jesus, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, was a blue and white painted concrete building with an arched roof and a small bell tower. When the water rose, most of the church went under. The arched roof and the bell tower did not. From that day onward, the image of the floating church roof has been a symbol of the new Petrolandia. It appears on the modern city's coat of arms. And the major droughts in 2013 and 2017 and 2021 and 2023, the rest of the church comes back. House foundations, streets, the cemetery walls, and diverse when through the nave of the church when the water is high. Petrolandia got its tower back. The other 10,000 of them did not. Some issues happen in plain sight and are simply not written down. In the eastern half of the state of Oklahoma, where the North Canadian and South Canadian rivers meet, there used to stand a town called North Fork. It was founded in the 1840s. It was a trading hub for the Muskogee, the Creek Nation, who had been forced west to Indian Territory along the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. They'd rebuilt their nation around towns like this one. After the American Civil War, after emancipation, the freed people who had been enslaved by Creek slaveholders settled in and around North Forktown. They were called Creek Freedmen. They built homes, they built churches, they built schools. They were citizens of the Creek Nation by treaty. Several historically black settlements grew up across this stretch of the rivers. They have names. Most of them have not been preserved in the published record. Outlaws passed through. Welsh was known to ride through the area in the 1880s. A tall sandstone outcrop in the bed of the Canadian River, a landmark called Standing Rock, was visible from the trading post. It had been a navigation marker for centuries before the trading post was built. In 1956, the United States Army Corps of Engineers began planning a reservoir along that stretch of the Canadian River. Construction began in 1956, but was finished in 1964. It was dedicated on the 25th of September 1964 by President Lyndon Johnson. It was called Lake Lally at 102,500 acres. It is one of the largest man-made lakes in the United States by surface area. Under it, the old town of North Fork, sections of 3 other settlements, more than 30 Creek Nation cemeteries, and the Black Creek Freedmen communities that had grown up along the rivers. About 3,500 residents were displaced. A disproportionate share of them were citizens of the Creek Nation and Creek Freedmen and their descendants on. Compensation was paid at fair market value. Cultural property was not weighed. Tribal sovereignty was not weighed. The graveyards were exhumed and relaid in new cemeteries on higher ground. The pattern was not unique to Lake Eufaula. Across eastern Oklahoma in the same decades, the same Army Corps had built reservoirs at 10 Killer, at Texoma, at Keystone, at Hugo, at Weber's Falls, at Robert Esker, each one submerged Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw land, each one submerged historically black freedmen settlements that had grown up after emancipation. The full inventory of those settlements has never been published. Some of them had names that locals remembered. Some of them did not have names that anyone outside them ever wrote down. Lake Eufaula does not drop low enough during typical drought to expose much. In the worst dry years, the Texas and Oklahoma drought of 2011 and 2012, the foundations of a few stone chimneys come back along the southern shoreline. The asphalt of old United States Highway 69, old Highway 266, still descends into the water at multiple boat ramps around the lake. Standing Rock has not come back. Creek Nation citizens and the descendants of the Creek freedmen have been documenting the displacement in oral history since the 1970s. Much of the documentation exists in tribal nation archives, in university special collections, and on family-held cassette tapes. Little of it has been compiled into a single published history. In 2021, the comedian and writer Amber Ruffin aired a segment on her late-night program titled Beyond Tulsa. The segment was about the deliberate flooding of historically black towns to make lakes, with a focus on the Oklahoma reservoir projects. And it was for the first time the pattern had been described in plain language to a national audience. The pattern had been there since 1964. The pattern had been there since the Trail of Tears. Creek Nation citizens and Creek freedmen descendants drive out to the southern shoreline of Lake Eufaula in dry years. They walk along the exposed mud to the foundations of stone chimneys, and they sit on those chimneys and they take photographs. Some of them are old enough to have been children in the settlements before the dam closed. They are in their 70s and 80s now. There's no museum to North Forktown. There's no bronze plaque listing the names of the displaced. There's no graffiti wall on a country road that has been repainted dozens of times by a community that has refused to let it fade. There's a lake, there are boat ramps, there are bass fishing tournaments held on the surface of it every summer. And the people who knew what was down there are the only people who know what was down there. The bell tower above the water in Huron is photographed about 100,000 times a year. The stone chimney foundations along the southern shoreline of Lake Eufaula are photographed by the families who remember them. When those families are gone, the chimneys will still be there. But there will not be anyone left who knows whose chimney it was. That is the difference. Huron had a tower, Lake Eufaula had community. Only one of them is on a postcard. 8 stories. Mologa, Quabbin, Capel, Celyn, Landod, and Lake Pedder. The 3 gorges, Old Tetrapetrolandia, Lake Eufaula. Different countries, different decades, different languages, the same kind of paperwork. City decides it, and it's water or electricity or both. And an engineering authority is given the legal power to take a valley. The valley is surveyed, the residents are notified, The graves are exhumed, the buildings are demolished, the road that descends into it is bulldozed at the new shoreline. And then the water rises. Sometimes the water leaves a tower above the surface. Last episode was about Turin, about Caliasen, about Mediano, San Román de Sau, about Villarino, about Potosi, about the places where the tower remained and what each one means to the people who still go back to look at it. This one was about the places where the tower did not remain, where the buildings were demolished, where the road was bulldozed at the new shoreline, where everything visible above the waterline was taken out before the gates closed, and the only thing left was the names carved on grey stones in a relocated cemetery in a town the four towns never knew, or painted in white on a ruined wall beside a quiet Welsh road, or held by the descendants of 150,000 people who were moved off the upper Volga, or carried in oral histories by the descendants of Greek freedmen on cassette tapes that no one outside their families has ever heard, or written a single book that was banned the year it was published, or never written down at all, because the woman who would have written it down climbed into a small biplane on a September morning in 1972 and never came back. Every reservoir in the world was built over inhabited lands. Everyone, cities that drink the water do not, as a general rule, know whose town it used to be. The people who used to live there are down, and for the most part, they're not asked. The reservoirs are useful. The reservoirs are necessary. The dams generate electricity that lights cities and pumps water to homes 1,000 kilometers away. We are not going to drain them. What we can do is remember whose valley it used to be, whose chapel, whose school, whose graveyard, whose language, whose cassette tape, whose two words on a ruined wall beside a quiet Welsh road. Pinquartzite Beach. The beach is still down there. The stone chimneys are still down there. Purple stones of the streets of Mologa are still down there. The town common of Dana is still walkable in dry years. The base of the chapel walls at Capel Celyn comes back when the summer is dry enough. The arched roof of the Sacred Heart of Jesus rises above the surface of Lake Itaparica most of the year. The tiger moth has not come back, and a woman in the back seat is still missing. Last episode ended on a phrase about bell towers, about the places where something visible was left to see. This one ends on the places where nothing was, on the names carved into grey stones in a town the four towns never knew, on a wall that gets repainted every time it is vandalized, on the museum in Rybinsk founded by the children and grandchildren of the displaced, on a cassette tape in a family cupboard in eastern Oklahoma, on a coroner's open verdict in a folder in a Tasmanian archive. 8 stories, 1 pattern, 100 years of it, and we still do not think of it as a pattern. The towers we remember Everything else is underneath. We will keep coming back to lakes. This channel is called The Quiet Hill. Subscribe, the next one will find you. Until then, remember whose valley it used to be.